Welcome to a new wave of entrepreneurship by Venture for Canada. Venture for Canada is a national charity on a mission to foster the entrepreneurial skills and mindsets of young Canadians. Our vision is a Canada where young people can equitably realize their entrepreneurial potential to help build one of the most prosperous entrepreneurial ecosystems in the world.
In this episode, join Kevin Kliman, CEO and co-founder of Humi, as he unveils the secrets of building a successful team in a high-growth tech environment. From his early days as a dentist and aspiring hockey player to leading Humi, Canada's top employment solution, Kevin shares his unique journey and insights, explore the challenges and triumphs of team building, reinvesting in the community, and nurturing tech talent in Canada. This episode is perfect for entrepreneurs, tech enthusiasts, and leaders looking to scale their teams effectively in the fast-paced tech world. I am super excited to have Kevin Kliman, the CEO of Humi, on Venture for Canada's podcast, A New Wave of Entrepreneurship. Kevin could do an episode on a ton of different topics, but today the theme of the episode is building a team in a high-growth startup. And companies and organizations are all about the people. And often the biggest challenges that entrepreneurs have are relating to HR and ultimately hiring and firing and building out a team. Kevin, really excited to have you on the program. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, and I'm super excited to be here. Really appreciate you having me on.
First area that we're going to dive into is that of the talent acquisition side and building out a team. Mm-hmm. Kevin, what are some of the ideal attributes that you look for in prospective employees when you're starting an early stage venture?
Yeah, I think the thing that a lot of people go to right away is risk or propensity to take on risk. Because when you start something, there's no surety that there's success in there. And so you're kind of making a bet for a number of, with your time, that the thing will work out. I actually think the better signal is their excitement and desire to have ownership in the thing that they build. I've found that the people wherein you bring them closer to the business and give them more autonomy and make them feel like the thing that they're building is actually their own, those people tend to flourish and have the greatest impact. And so that is being what I've looked for more and more so as I've built out Humi. And I don't think that's really changed from the starting days to today. We're not a huge company, but we're 150 people. And I find that the people who come in and who are more mission oriented and want to be a part of building this thing that they feel like, a real kinship with tend to do the best.
When you're building out your interview process, how do you look for those kind of attributes, that sense of taking ownership and being ambitious with one's work?
It's a good question. I think that you look to historical markers more so than anything else. What have they done in the past? What gets them excited? When you talk about what they would be doing internally and where the company is going, can you see a glint in their eye, an inflection in the way they speak? And, you can feel when people get excited. You get the shared sense. And to me, that is the real thing that you got to look for when you're hiring somebody at a company that's relatively early stages.
Conversely, what are some of the red flags for employees who might have a low sense of ownership or a low sense of ambition?
I think it's the missionary versus mercenary thing. If comp is the number one thing, I also look at their past, and it's interesting to see how much time they spent in each company. This isn't a complete red flag, but if you see a year at 3 or 4 companies in a row, it might signal that an inability to build trust and relationships with coworkers or to build a material amount of value long term. A year seems like a long time to be at a company, but it's actually relatively short. You onboard, it takes a couple months. You got to build trust and relationships, understand the systems. And the truth is, if you leave within a year, you're probably looking at month 6 or month 9. And so that to me is also a red flag. But you always have to do discovery because there's always a story behind the thing. And I think the best interviewers and best hirers have great ways to pull that out of people. That's off script for them.
What do you think some of those ways are? Like some of those tactics for an interviewer can kind of go off script and really get to understand someone's story?
Um, hmm. I like the top grading approach where you ask somebody to walk you through their work history and maybe even like farther back to start from youth and maybe like the thing that they loved, whether it was sports or theater or music or whatnot. And, especially once you've gotten into the work experience, it's really helpful to understand who they worked with and what the relationships were like. And, this is a tougher thing to do with somebody, but it's best if you can ask them for very specific references. And so if I've gotten a story of the last 2 to 3 workplaces you've been at and the people on those teams, the people you reported into, if I can ask specifically to talk to those people about their experiences, I've always found it much more valuable than asking for a couple of generalized references who are just like the people who are going to say glowing things.
Earlier, you referred to the dichotomy of mercenary versus missionary, and another entrepreneur recently described that concept to me. Can you dive into that and just define like what are those two different things, and what are those kind of attributes in employees?
Yeah. A so I think the easiest way to think about it is zero sum versus not. For somebody who's zero sum, they tend to view things more through the lens of what they can get out of the company and have a lot less thought towards what value it will create for everybody else. Whereas the person who is more of a missionary believes that being a part of building something meaningful has a whole bunch of additional value that isn't quite as tangible, but can be realized in the future. So, like, if you're the second or third or 10th employee at a company that becomes Shopify, you eventually get an incredible amount of social capital out of that. You build an awesome network of people who highly trust you. There are a whole bunch of additional benefits that come from building that thing that a person will inherit, like, will either understand at the outset or will be excited about, building into. Whereas a mercenary is much more interested in the salary comp. I think title is also an interesting way to source for this. I've always had a weird relationship with titles where I've, as a business builder, I'm like, this is bullshit. What are you responsible for? Because that is the most meaningful thing. I understand that it has a ton of value for people to the outside world. And, within a company, it's a signaling mechanism once you get big enough. But I found that the people who anchor on the importance of title tend to overwhelmingly be more so on the mercenary side than the missionary side. So, if I'm bringing in somebody who's more senior, who's excited about the business, and I ask them how important title is, and they say, I don't give a shit, to me, that's a really positive signal.
I've heard many entrepreneurs over the years complain that it's hard to find salespeople who have that missionary mentality, that a lot of salespeople are mercenaries. And it's tough because a salesperson comes in, they do a good job for a year, then they may get an offer for 20% more money somewhere else, they peace out and they go there. Do you think that it is a valid belief that salespeople are inherently more mercenary?
Yeah, I think it is something that helps them succeed by being more skewed that way. And I think the way to understand which camp a salesperson sits in is by talking through the systems that are set up for salespeople and their potential involvement with forming those things. A lot of people want a ton of structure, an OTE that they're, have a ton of confidence in, scripts, buying personas, all this good stuff. They want those from day one, and that's a signal for them that they can make a lot of money. Other people care less about that and get excited by the prospect of building those things inside of a company. So I do think you're right that the thing that makes salespeople good is also the thing that should like push them towards being more of a mercenary. But there are a lot of people out there who love the idea of ownership and being a part of something and building systems. And that's what makes for great early salespeople at a startup.
So far, we've been talking about what are the attributes to look for in early stage companies. How do you think that those attributes shift as the company grows? So essentially, Kevin, what are the attributes that you look for when in a company is, let's say, 50 employees? What are the attributes that you currently look to for today when your company is 150 employees?
It's interesting. I think a lot of the principles you'd want to keep the same, like cultural stuff, shouldn't change too much. Um, I do think there's something to be said about scale experience and somebody who's been through the 20 to 50 to 100 to a couple hundred employees and who understands how to build teams and communicate within growing teams. That is really important. This is not a great answer because it's such a tough problem to solve, and the truth is I don't think there is a perfect answer here. Ideally, you have somebody who feels the same, but who has more like a way to build context quickly. I think that's probably it. For employees who've been around for a long time inside of an organization, they have a ton of historical context and trust built up within the organization. It allows them to be very effective. For somebody who comes in at that level, to be able to build that quickly and maintain it over time is a skill into itself. And I would say looking for that is a like good signal to key in on.
If you have somebody applying to your company, and let's say their resume is like 5 years at Google, 5 years at Amazon, like 2 years at Meta, like they've only worked in big tech, they've only worked in these huge organizations, and then they want to work at a smaller or medium-sized company. Do you ever have a reticence to hire people who have like no startup or medium-sized company experience?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you have to, the kind thing is to read them the Miranda rights of like, this is very different. Like, what's your expectation? This might be much shittier or harder or not aligned with what I think it's really important to press on the delta between what they've experienced and what this will be. There are a lot of people out there who are looking for that change. But it's also very important to understand why. Is this so that they can buy a lottery ticket to make a whole bunch more money because they think that that's the way to do it? Is this because they want to like put their name on something that is going to build meaningful value and they can like feel like they've owned the creation of that value? Like I certainly would have pause and I think the best thing to do is to try and talk somebody out of it or to play the counter to them. It's just such a radically different experience working at a company where, you can call up the CEO at any point and probably have two phone calls and make a change internally versus like, you got to go through the legal machine. And it takes like months to get a button changed or whatnot.
Venture for Canada, we're a lot smaller. We're only around 35 employees, but the final step of our interview process is like a 15, 20-minute conversation just with me that's a little casual. But one of the things I try to do is very similar to what you described, which is almost like sell somebody to not take the job, like really push them to be like, is this something you want? This is a more ambiguous environment than if you worked in government or larger kind of nonprofits. And I have found that it is very effective, partially because when they then start and they're like, okay, this is a lot more ambiguous than what I'm used to, that no one can say, oh, you didn't tell me. It's like, no, it was said very clearly from the outset. One question that I have for you, Kevin, is in our pre-chat, you talked about how you I think are the only dentist slash insurance agent in Canada, and you have a kind of unique background where you were like a high level like college athlete. You played hockey at Brown. you became a dentist. You also got your insurance license. You've now been a tech entrepreneur. You have a very unique like CV and kind of like career path. And likewise, Kevin, like when you see people's like CVs that are applying to your company and they also have like a very eclectic kind of path or mixture of life experiences, is that something that you find is like compelling or makes a good fit for a startup environment?
Interesting. I think what you need to understand is what the common thread is across like that whole string of stuff. So like I have a weird background, like you said, dentist, now insurance broker, a number of different like software startups. So I was raised in a family, a doctor and a dentist, very conservative. This was just like the expectation for where I ended up. But I've always been very entrepreneurial. First company before college, whole bunch of side hustles and like little software projects during college. Ended up in dental school because it was like a family thing. A whole bunch of entrepreneurial endeavors there. So it wasn't like I graduated, became a dentist, decided I'd prefer to do startups. I've been building and like trying to like do little hustles since I was like, 14, 15. So I think it's really important if somebody has a very eclectic background, which I love. I think following your own path, something that is not prescribed, being an independent thinker, is so, so awesome. I think it's really important to understand like what has driven that. Is it situational? Is it like, like there's just so many reasons to push people down different types of paths. And if you can understand that, you can better understand the person and better fit them within your org or not. Long answer to say like weird people are awesome, and as much diversity of backgrounds, the more diversity with like life experiences and backgrounds, I think the better for a company. Long. I hope, did I answer your question? I feel like I'm rambling a bit.
No, that was great. And one question popped in my head that is a little bit off theme, and it's probably the only time I've asked this question in the history of this podcast is, what are some of the entrepreneurial lessons that you learned from dental school?
Yeah, so interesting. Attention to detail was attention to detail, and also empathy for the process. So I can break down both of those two. When you go through dental school, one of the things they test you on with respect to like preparing cavities is being accurate within a quarter of a millimeter. And so the margin of error is super, super small. It makes you very detail oriented, which is probably why like a ton of type A people are drawn to the profession. And you're just forced to think about that quarter of a millimeter so much that you consider all the other factors involved. And I think that's a very important component of starting a business and trying to recruit people and solve problems. The other one, the second thing, in like empathy for the process during dental school. So one of the types of services that a dentist does for a person is to make them a crown. And oftentimes you take an impression, you send it to a lab, they fabricate this beautiful like porcelain fused to metal thing, send it back to you, and you put it in. During dental school, they force you to do the entire process of creating that crown, from like, doing the wax up of the actual like crown itself. You have to create a mold. You have to melt metal and pour it into the mold. And then you have to polish and fashion that to the tooth itself. It's a huge pain in the ass. And like, I did not enjoy it at all, but it made me appreciate so much about what they do and how I like prepare, the thing that needs to go to the lab to create the thing. So like forcing me to understand that process and like the empathy that is required to be built there makes you better at the underlying craft. I think the same is true in business. Like you're trying to solve a problem within an industry. The more understanding you can have of that particular industry, maybe not at the outset, like it's good to have a beginner mind, but then once you start down the path of solving the problem, it's so important to understand the context around like why the problem exists, who like is around the table, how do they affect what you do, so I think those two things are the biggest things that have come out of dental school that have helped me in building businesses.
That's a fascinating answer, and not something at all that we had prepped. Oh yeah, sorry, you go.
I got one more thing for you: hard work. Uh, One of the things I used to bash my buddies who went to like investment banking and private equity and consulting. I was like, man, you work so many hours. You're like an absolute slave. You make a bunch of money, but like you work super, super hard. What I didn't realize is I ended up going to dental school, working just as hard, but paying money instead of actually making money. Like work ethic has existed my entire life, but like to go through a professional school, it just absolutely forces you to understand what hard work is and like focused hard work to an extent that I hadn't experienced before. That's the other thing I'm grateful coming out of dental school.
And I feel like dentistry, like being a dentist is not an easy job as well. Like it's both physically really hard on somebody in the sense of like you're like leaning. There was someone I know who his like brother and father, and there's a lot of dentists in his family, and he was just saying it's a huge issue of like back issues in dentists from just practicing. That's to say, I think dentists are pretty well compensated, and a lot of them work like 3 days a week, and they have a lot of pros. But although I have heard that the rise of like big dentistry has like and the potentially like there's more dentists per capita than in the past, so it's like maybe a little like the macroeconomic conditions of dentists are potentially shifting, but that's another interview.
I've got so many thoughts here that's a whole other podcast. Yeah, like you're correct on all those fronts. So yeah.
All right, sounds good. But round 2 of this interview will be the future of the dental industry in Canada.
Cool. I can't wait to talk shit about PE firms. This is my second favorite thing to do.
Oh yeah, because I've read about a lot of the private equity firms or like consolidation firms, like buying up dentists.
Yeah, it's awful. Like the quick like summary of it. I did dental school in Los Angeles, and in California, they're like a decade ahead with respect to roll-ups, and it disintermediates dentists from owning practices. Dentists build less long-term relationships with people and families. Also, you lose a lot of the ability to prescribe care. So these big companies build big machines, and they put practice managers in there who tell dentists what to do. Long story short, it's not a good thing, but it's a really good business.
And Dr. Yuri, my dentist, if you're listening, I appreciate you and the fact you own your business and provide great service. So it's as an aside, I go to this dentist in Etobicoke named Dr. Yuri, and I think I am one of the only non-Ukrainians who go to this dentist office. But it's a testament. It's such a community feel. When I go in there, it's like everyone knows each other. It's the part of the Ukrainian community, even though I'm not Ukrainian. So anyway, I can see the benefits of like locally owned, community-based dentists.
Yeah, listen, he cares way more as opposed to like you're at a chain. You're going to see a different dentist like every time. They don't know you. They don't really care. It's more transactional.
Yeah. Shifting gears a little bit back to the building in teams in high growth environments. One metric that is often used to kind of assess the job performance of kind of talent acquisition professionals is speed to hire. Kevin, can you describe a little bit like what does speed to hire mean, and why is it important?
Sure. Speed to hire is important because if you have a job opening that you're looking to fill, then there's a business objective tied to it. And it's very likely that the ramp time has a meaningful impact on the business objective. But it's this like balancing act because, if you get that, there's a large price to pay. It's very expensive if you get that hire wrong. You're just trying to balance this of like, how can we get the best person in quickest to get us to where, for the purpose that we've like said we want to hire this person.
One follow-up question is, what is a good speed to hire time for an entry-level role? And what is a good speed to hire time for like a more senior role?
Honestly, like you need so much more context. It would be so hard for me to answer that without knowing the type of position, the business need, where we're at. Like the market conditions. I think that's an impossible question to answer unless you have a whole lot more context.
Yeah, I agree, because there's some entry level roles that maybe they're really specific, right? Or let's say you're hiring somebody who's like chief of staff or like a junior, like kind of business analyst reporting right into you. That might be like a really specialized role, not in the sense of skill set, but maybe what you're looking for. Versus if you're hiring like a sales development representative and there's like 30 of them, there's a different speed to hire potentially. One question that I have, because I know that something a lot of entrepreneurs struggle with, is how to sometimes accelerate speed to hire, because often there's this pressure where let's say there's a business unit leader and they're like, okay, we need 5 people and we need them like tomorrow. But the reality is sometimes it can take months to get the right people in role. So what are ways that people leaders can speed up the speed to hire without hurting kind of the quality of hires?
Yeah. The number one thing is to have a great network and to hire people with great networks who have trust and know great people. We recently brought in somebody wherein like the whole process was like a couple of weeks for a very important role. And from the outside looking in, it would seem ridiculously fast. I've been hanging out with that person for close to 5 years. So it's like, is it 2 weeks or is it 5 years and 2 weeks? And the truth is, it's much better to build trust at a time where there's no like transaction attached to that thing. So if you can build a great network of talented people through friendship, through mutual love of technology or startups or board games or sport, like it doesn't matter. Like I think it is a very important component of being able to hire quickly. It's just trust with people.
And fostering social networks that can be advantageous to you as relates to hiring. I'm part of this entrepreneur peer group that's been around for 3 years. And the group, after around 3 years, a lot of people wanted to leave the group and kind of go to different things. So the group was going to die. And then I reflected on it and I said, no, I want this group to keep on kind of living. So then recruited 4 or 5 new people into the group. And there's a lot of benefits for it, but part of it is that talent pipeline, right? Like I think of all the relationships, the contacts that were built from the kind of first iteration of the group. Anyway, not to go kind of on a tangent, but it's basically to say that I think like investing in social relationships with other entrepreneurs, with other people who are hiring, firing, and have access to talent networks and developing meaningful relationships can like significantly increase someone's talent funnel. What are, like, when you reflect on your life and career, Kevin, like what are some of the communities you've been a part of or things that you've done that have helped you to foster those kind of like social connections, which then help you as it relates to hiring?
Oh man. There's just so many different awesome communities that I've had the pleasure of being a part of. It's hard to name one, or like YC has been awesome. The Toronto startup ecosystem also. When I started my first company over a decade ago, it was alongside a lot of other people starting companies who weren't successful in their first, but were very successful in their second. And spending the time like having beers, doing like positive sum stuff, like just doing nice stuff for people, helping them without asking for stuff. Like these are the things that like in the moment, there's no ROI in, but have had massively positive, outcomes for me and for Humi, just generally. I'm trying to think of a specific example, but if somebody's moving, offer to move. Like, do they have a car? Give them your car. Like, do things that are outside the norm that are like especially nice, that like extend trust in a way where it might not be warranted yet. And you get burned every once in a while. That's fine. But, like that one person who is over the moon excited is going to yield like a whole bunch of positive stuff. And normally it's like 4 or 5 other people, or it's just like them talking to other people. But it's impossible to know like coming in. And it's also impossible to think about it as a like, what is the return on investment here? And it's also one of these compounding things. Like it takes years for these things to play out. So you just have to like understand and buy into this in order to for this type of thing to work out.
And I'll share an anecdote from our mutual friend, Josh McIntyre, who connected us, Kevin, is
Yeah.
when I spoke with Josh a couple of months ago that you were going to be on the podcast. He was at the board offsite. He was up until very recently on the board of Venture for Canada, and he's a Venture for Canada program participant. And one of the things that he said he really appreciates about you is that like whenever there's like a major announcement about Grammarly, like you'll shoot him a text or send him an email being like, congrats on this kind of like milestone. And he just said, and I share this because I don't think he would mind, and I think it's a really positive thing about you is that he appreciates, like he was reflecting that of almost anyone he knows, like you do a really good job of like keeping in touch and like celebrating the wins when they come up. So anyway, I thought I would share that anecdote because I think it's a testament to, at least from our shared connection, of how you like keep in touch and create meaningful kind of connections.
Awesome. Actually, you bring up a really interesting point that I've always like believed in to a large extent. There are things that you can do that are very inexpensive, that are very meaningful to other people, and you should always do those things. And I love this within the company, like people, doing thoughtful things for customers or thoughtful things for other employees to send them a personal note with like how much you appreciate it is like a 5-second thing that can be very meaningful for somebody who's working with you, who's like just come in, who's learning the culture. And those things I've found have like really been a benefit to me and, to the company throughout the last like decade or so.
Oh, totally. Small gestures can make a huge difference. It could brighten someone's day. And it can sometimes take like 2 seconds. Like even right before we started this interview, I sent an email to somebody who he had just been selected as like a C100 fellow and someone I knew. And I said, hey, congrats. Awesome to see the news. Like hope was well. Literally took me less than like a minute, but I know it's a nice way just to kind of keep in touch and kind of foster that relationship. One of the things that I think it is a little bit trying to build that muscle, right? Like the more you do it, the more that your brain sort of instinctually thinks, hey, that's good news. Send a person like a congrats note. So really great tip, Kevin. Shifting to kind of the next part of the conversation, which is about interview process. Can you describe a little bit about what does the Humi interview process look like today? Recognizing that I'm sure it differs based on role type and the level of seniority, but at a high level, what are the main components of your interview process?
Yeah, absolutely. So the assumption here is that it is like the 95% of hires that aren't like within the executive group. We have a phenomenal recruiter, and firstly, she'll build the requisites for the job, working with the hiring manager and the team to find out who they're looking for, what attributes are important, how does she help screen to find like candidates that would be really good. We build a job description, post it, people will promote through LinkedIn. She will do, our recruiter will do the first interview with people as a bit of a litmus test on culture, but also to make sure that person is a good fit for the role. And then depending on what the role is, she will help facilitate conversations with the hiring manager and people within the team. And then depending on the role and how much like cross-department collaboration is necessary, might pull in a person or two from different departments whose job would be affected by this person joining the team. So the first one is more cultural and like high level fit, and then depending on the role, it gets into much more tactical stuff, and we'll often have some sort of homework's a bad thing, some sort of like proof of work that helps them understand like what our expectations would be and gives us a good sense for how that person would work independently, but also with us collaboratively.
Kevin, I imagine you have done so many interviews over the years, and you probably asked like 1,000 different interview questions. But what is your favorite interview question to ask, and why do you particularly like that question?
A friend of mine gave me this question. The question is, okay, you were born, and then what? and that's it. And you leave it incredibly open-ended. And it's so interesting to hear where people like pick that up and where they go with it. Some people will dip into their childhood and their middle school and their family and their origin story. Some will start at the beginning of their CV. Some will start at the beginning of like the job search. I love it because it's open, like the open-endedness of it gives you a sense for where the person's head is at and like how they think about their journey up until this point.
I love that question as well. Also, because I think it tests somebody's like comfortability with ambiguity. Like if somebody gets that question, they're like, "Oh, I don't know how to answer," and they just get freaked out and they just don't really say anything. Then that tells you a lot. Okay, maybe that person can only deal with like a little box, and they can't deal with ambiguous situations. So that's definitely a question that I will reflect on potentially using in the future in my context as well. One other important topic is that bias is obviously something that can come up in interviews. And how do you work to remove bias out of the interview process?
Great question. And my answer might be somewhat controversial. I don't believe that all bias is bad. And I think like the best way to approach it is to think about which biases are like would be positive and which wouldn't. You know, you don't want to have a bias around people's race or sexuality or sex or like these are all things that should not be in the mix. But a bias towards action and ownership and a lot of the cultural values that you really value. If there's a way to understand like allow those types of biases to creep in versus the other, I think like it allows you to hire quicker with higher trust. And back to something we had talked about earlier, when you have network buildup, there's a whole bunch of bias inherent in hiring people that you know and have known for a while. But those tend to be some of the better, like the biases that you want, assuming that the person doing the hiring is somebody with the cultural values that you want embodied within the company. And in terms of the bad biases, I imagine this is the thing. I don't have a great answer. We have a DI committee internally, and this is a hot topic and something that gets talked about often. I've seen a whole bunch of tools out there that are built specifically for this. I actually don't have a great answer for like the best way to go about this. I think right now, considering like how top of mind and how important, like, all the things that are coming to market and coming to light about like being able to remove biases, I think it's just trying things and being intentional about like continually like improving the process to remove these things over time.
Yeah, and recognizing it's a journey and that it's through many tweaks of process, many small kind of changes over time that I think a process can gradually become more inclusive. And to your other point about the kind of potential for like looking at certain like bias towards action, like one of the things that I was thinking about and reflecting what you're talking about is like that importance of like pattern recognition. That like essentially, I think when you're looking at like when you're kind of like, okay, this I 5 people have been hired as salespeople, and they all are people who have like a deep kind of passion for like life. Like they just have these like these bigger than life kind of like personalities, and that's a good fit for that role. Then I can see how pattern recognition can become like a really powerful thing, especially when you hire a lot of people.
Another great example of sales reps. I've found that people who've gone through the zero, who've sold copiers, the zero copying machine, tend to have gone through the ringer and like very rigorous sales training, and are often like very capable, very good salespeople. So yeah, like to your point of looking at pattern matching, there are certainly strings that you can like notice and pull on that I think make hiring more effective and quicker. And then like in terms of like rooting out negative biases, I think there's a lot of interesting ways to approach like CVs where you don't see somebody's name, no images, like no profile images before like deciding to screen that person. Again, like I don't know what like the answer is to rooting out all of those negative biases, but I think there's a lot of really interesting tools coming to market right now that should be considered and tested as a means of doing that.
Awesome. Kevin, do you have any final kind of closing words or thoughts for listeners on how to build a team in a high growth startup?
Yeah, there's a lot of important components. I think trust is number one. Regardless of what your culture is, the better the trust is between yourself and everybody else, the better it facilitates all the things that you really want. Moving quicker, better decision making, better context sharing, less politics. And I would emphasize that any way in which you can better build trust within your team is a very worthwhile investment. Is it like a board game night? Is it hackathons? Is it, showing up with chicken soup when somebody's sick? Is it a nice little note? Who knows what it is for your company, but do the extra things to build trust. It helps everything.
As they say, things move at the speed of trust, and trust is an essential ingredient for getting anything done, because in a low trust environment, it is like molasses to get anything done because no one trusts each other. Kevin, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. A lot of great takeaways for myself, including a great interview question to ask, so you're born, so what? And a lot of other great reflections on how do you build a hiring process that can really help scale a technology company over time. Thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Awesome. Thank you for having me, Scott. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to this episode of A New Wave of Entrepreneurship. Stay connected with us via our socials and through our email list. And be sure to subscribe to us in your favorite podcast app so you don't miss our next episode. Have feedback on today's episode? Let us know directly in the app. Thanks again for listening and for joining the new wave of entrepreneurs. Till next time.